Okay, so a quick introduction to this video, or how this video came about. I made a video response to a hangout that Christy Winters did just over a week ago now, I would say, and that was a long video, and I touched on about 18 different things there, but probably half of the responses that I got all related to one thing, which was my usage of the term patriarchy. And I'm going to use, for the basis of this video and for clarity, to refer to that from now on as a statistical patriarchy, to get away from these other ideas of patriarchy, because what that resulted in is quite a lot of discussion about the ways in which different definitions of patriarchy are conflated with one another, and in terms of the ways in which definitions of patriarchy are conflated with the feminist idea of patriarchy theory. And the problems that it causes in miscommunication and perhaps sometimes deliberate misdirection of conversations, and what I call conversational gerrymandering. And I wanted to make a video that sort of embellished on a lot of that and explored that in a lot more detail. And so I'd spent a couple of days scoping that video out. But as I have a want to do, I keep adding little bits to the video. And one of the bits that I added to the video that I was going to tack on the end, as it turned out, I started thinking more and more about that than the general video, and I found that a little bit more interesting in some ways than the general video, or perhaps a little bit more, in the now, in the moment. And so that's what I wanted to make this video about, and that is what this video is about. So if you think about this idea that I'm talking about a statistical patriarchy, which is just this example of a system where in the legislature or government of a country, the great majority of elected representatives are men, right? And that's all it says. It doesn't say anything about bias or gender norms or any of that. It's just the statistical facts of the matter. And as something that came up several times during International Women's Day recently in the United Kingdom on the news was the fact that only 29% of the members of Parliament in the House, sit in the House of Commons, our lower chamber where all the proper business takes place. Only 29% of members of Parliament were female, 71% are male, and this is seen as a problem. Why? Because people have this idea that they want Parliament to in some ways represent or match or match the kind of balance of mix of people that are out there in the rest of the country. And I do kind of understand that from an ideological perspective. Of course, it's very much a case of pick and choose the bits that you want, isn't it? The average age of an MP in 2010 was 50 years old. There were no MPs, in fact, at that point, younger than 33 years old. So where was the representation of younger people as younger people there? Nowhere to be seen. 90% of members of Parliament were graduates, but only about 20% of the population generally were graduates. So where was the statistical representation of people who were not graduates there? In terms of scientists, there was not one single, for the first time in recorded history, not one single member of Parliament had a history as a scientist. Not one single fucking member of Parliament. And yet the concern is not really over the fact that there isn't one single person able to with some authority stand up and speak for Parliament, for science in Parliament. It's the fact that only 29% of MPs are female. Okay, so people do have these perhaps slightly skewed ideologies on it, but I can still understand the ideological perspective. But what I was more interested in was the pragmatic perspective. What tangible difference does it make to women and women's issues, and whatever constitutes women's issues, the fact that only 29% of MPs are women? Now, some people will frame any issue as a women's issue, as a gendered issue, right? Any issue is a gendered issue, but I kind of find that a bit misdirecting or a bit misleading. Why? Because clearly most issues, men and women span the political spectrum fairly broadly, don't they? There may be some slight statistical difference, but there are conservative women and Labour women and conservative men and Labour men. And if you're a left-leaning Labour, lifelong Labour voting woman, having another 136 Margaret Thatchers in the Houses of Parliament to balance the books isn't really going to butter many parsnips for you, is it? That's not really increasing your level of representation just because she's got a fucking minge and a pair of tits, or at least she did when she was alive, right? So for most issues, whether your political representative is male or female isn't really that much of an issue, I wouldn't suggest. But I do accept that there are some issues which are gendered issues, which do either affect men more than women or women more than men, or which the divide between the way in which men and women align is substantially greater than it is over the majority of issues. And I'm quite happy to regard those as gendered issues and explore them. So surely the case then is to say that unless we have 50% of or approaching 50% of members of parliament as women, then these women's issues are going to get short shrift. They're going to get short-changed. They won't get looked at with the level of seriousness that they deserve to be looked at. And so the corollary of that would be, at present, those issues that disproportionately affect men will be getting highlighted and dealt with on the spot. Why? Because 71% of MPs are of that gender that is disfavoured by that particular thing. But the more examples of that I thought of, the more, and I can't really give you necessarily a statistical case for some of this, it's just going by feeling, and that's why I want to kind of throw this out there. But of the ones that I thought of, the more examples I thought of, the more counter examples it seems that I thought of. So one of the things that I thought of immediately was the issue of homelessness, by which I mean the worst kind of homelessness, which is sleeping rough on the streets. Rough sleeping is something that I knew disproportionately affects men quite considerably. I thought it was about 80%. I went and looked the numbers up, and the most reliable numbers that I could find was that it's actually 90%. It's worse than I thought. About 9 out of every 10 people that are sleeping rough on the streets in the United Kingdom, under the moon and stars there, in the cold, all the way through the winter, are men. And that kind of got me thinking. What was interesting, by the way, with regard to that, kind of ironic, which was that when I looked that statistic up and put that into Google and the results came up, it was either the first or second one which was there, but it was the first one that I clicked on, was something, I recall it was crisis.org.uk, and an article on homelessness in London, and they said that 88% of homeless in London, according to their statistics, were men and 12% were women, but the 12% that were women were the real issue. Because it's worse for a woman to be homeless, and so this is the issue that needs to be tackled. The 12% of homeless that constitutes that they're made up of women, and that kind of tickled me a little bit. That even though this was an issue that was so overwhelmingly an issue that affected men, no, the real issue here, this is the real issue now. It's the fact that there are some homeless women. That's the bit that we need to deal with. So how this appears to me, and tell me if you think I've got this wrong, is that this isn't an issue that people really, especially members of parliament, seem to give two fucks about. The fact that people are sleeping rough on the streets, despite the fact that it's an issue that overwhelmingly affects men, despite the fact that it is a horrible position to be in. I mean, it's a really, truly horrible thing to be sleeping rough on the streets and have nowhere to go, right? And ask me this, riddle me this, because 71% of MPs are male and they don't really seem to give a damn about this issue that affects men more. So, this is what I'm asking, right? And I'm interested in everybody, but if you're an MRA or an anti-feminist, I kind of know what you're going to say. So I'm really interested in what feminists think about this, actually, and what women think about this, actually, as well. Imagine the situation was reversed. How would the UK government and the parliament, how would that be tackled, do you think? Imagine if when you walk through the streets of London or any of the great cities of the United Kingdom, most of the people you saw in the doorways there were women. Imagine if the statistic was reported in the newspapers that 9 out of 10 people that sleeping rough on the streets in the United Kingdom were women. is the argument, is the claim that actually, well, because most MPs are male, we'd give even less of a shit about it than we do now? Because I just find that so incredibly difficult to believe. You know, I tend to think that in actual fact it would be trumpeted from the towers as this national scandal. A, because women were sleeping rough on the streets, and so many women were sleeping rough on the streets. But two, what would it say about our society that we have a society where the vast majority of people who are sleeping rough on the streets are women? What must we be doing to women that's leading to 9 out of 10 of those who sleep rough on the streets as being women? So I don't know, that's how I perceive that it would be. I'd be interested to know what anybody else thinks. And I know that one response that I will get from some feminists would be along the lines of, well, this is because patriarchy hurts men too. I'd like to ward you off making that retort, because I know that sounds really, really clever when I'm saying I'm talking about the patriarchy here, or a patriarchy. But remember, I'm talking about a statistical patriarchy, which is just simply that the majority of elected representatives are male. I'm not talking about patriarchy in the way that you're now referring to it as this series of gender norms and gender expectations and stereotypes and stereotypical roles and expectations that we have for men versus women, and then I think somewhat erroneously tying that into patriarchy. So in some sense, if society wasn't patriarchal, the gender norms and expectations that we had would miraculously be an entirely different set, right? I'm not talking about any of that. All I'm talking about is increasing the number of female MPs. So all you can imagine is next election, right, we have a quota system, 50% of MPs are female. What difference would that be making? That's the only thing that you can take into account there. You can't start looking at different gender norms and expectations. But then I started to think of other scenarios which have maybe changed over and mutated, such as the field of education, which is a really interesting one because girls outperform boys quite significantly now, and that has gone on for some time. GCSEs were introduced in, I think, 1988 in England and Wales, maybe in Scotland as well. I think they have their own qualification there for those who are 16 years old. And even at that point, girls were significantly outperforming boys at that level, and that gap has only grown. And admittedly, in the last few years, there seems to be some political will to look into what is changed, what is happening there. And apparently a similar gap exists in the United States, and apparently there's virtually no political will whatsoever to look into that gap, despite again this same kind of statistical patriarchy, a male president and the majority of those in the Senate and the House of Representatives being male. That political will doesn't seem to be there. Men don't seem to be getting favoured, despite this is being an issue that disfavours boys. But this kind of carries on, and the interesting thing is that originally, if you went back enough decades, boys outperformed girls, and that was seen as an issue that needed to be addressed. And then as time has moved on, girls have started to outperform boys more and more subjects, and as that has happened, the issue has been, well, why are boys still outperforming girls in these other subjects? And then the same has happened at A-levels, and then in terms of going to university and doing degrees, 55% of graduates in the United Kingdom are female, only 45% of graduates are male, and that doesn't seem to be anything that people are giving too many shits about. The thing that people seem to be giving a lot of shits about now is STEM. Now that's the real game now, it's STEM. Okay, so girls are doing better at GCSEs, they're doing better at A-levels, they're doing better in terms of the numbers that are going to university and getting better degrees. So the thing we're interested in now is STEM. And that, to me, if you look at the statistics, in actual fact, 58% of graduates that pass in 2011 in medicine were female, 80% in subjects allied to medicine were female, 61% in the biological sciences were female, 62% in law were female. In the physical sciences, it was 43% female, mathematical sciences, 42% female, engineering and computer science, a much bigger gap, 14 and 17%, right? So seemingly in the biological sciences and law and medicine, those are female-dominated fields. About 6 out of every 10 are female, whereas in physics and mathematics, 6 out of every 10 are male. And yet the only two we seem to give a shit about are the physical sciences and mathematics. The fact that medicine and law are dominated by women, despite the fact that these are two of the... And this is what I don't really get my head around with this, given that... Bear in mind, I'm not saying that these are issues that concern me specifically as issues, but I'm viewing them in the light of 71% of our representatives as being male, and so surely we should be being more interested in male issues. Law and medicine are two of the best paying professions that you can go into. If you wanted to make a purely economic decision, which a lot of this STEM argument seems to boil down to, right, prestige fields that pay well, don't go into engineering. Right, don't go into computer science, because most people who do those are on lower paid jobs. The average mechanical or electrical engineer in the United Kingdom earns about 40,000. A general practitioner, that's a family doctor in the United Kingdom, the average salary for a general practitioner is about £100,000. So these are really well-paying options to go into medicine and law, and women are overrepresented in them. But where's the stink about that? There's no stink about it. Nobody gives a fuck about it, and nobody is giving a fuck about it, despite the fact that the majority of MPs, 71%, are male. And as you go forward into first employments, it turns out that now the majority is, as you go into first employments, women are picking up the better jobs and their starting salaries are higher than men. Again, it doesn't seem to be anything we give too much of a fuck about. No, STEM. That's the thing that we need to give a fuck about here. So the perception that I have with these things, like I say, it's not that I'm flying a sort of MRA flag and saying we need to be concerned about these men's issues of homelessness and the underrepresentation of men in law and medicine. To be honest, I don't particularly give a flying fuck about these things that much, right? But it's if the claim is that the only way that women's issues, gendered women issues that affect women more, are going to be taken seriously is if 50% of MPs were female. What the fuck does taken seriously actually look like? Isn't it the case that already we are taking women's issues much more seriously than men's issues? And when you have a comparative issue such as the performance of boys and girls in school in a particular subject, we're much more interested and motivated when boys are outperforming girls than when girls are outperforming boys. In any area of employment, in any area of study, we only really seem to be interested in it when the disparity disfavours women rather than men. In my own sphere, the fire service, for the majority of the 20 years that I've been involved, a big issue has been legitimate ways in which we can try and get more female firefighters involved, right? We need to encourage more women to get more representation, to get a greater, more equal gender mix with regards to firefighting. But perhaps one of the best jobs that you can compare firefighters to has always been nurses, in terms of the way that they're often perceived by the public, in terms of the rates of pay. The big difference, there are two big differences between nurses and firefighters. One is that there's about 10 times more nurses than there are firefighters, so you'd think that would be 10 times bigger an issue. And the other difference between those two things is that whereas about 9 out of 10 firefighters are male, about 9 out of 10 nurses are female. And yet if you look at the Royal College of Nursing or any organisation and see if they've been doing similar things to encourage men to join join nursing, having recruitment days and doing all these kinds of things, or having a look at the way that they structure themselves, they've done absolutely fuck all. In fact, something that took place even before I joined was that the term fireman was changed to firefighter, so it wouldn't dissuade women. Whereas in the NHS, they still use the term sister and matron to this very day. So why this discrepancy? Well, the discrepancy results because political pressure has been applied for several decades on the fire service to try and get more women to join, and no political pressure has been applied on the sphere of nursing to try and get more men to join. And this is the point that I'm making. That has been the situation. A situation that disfavours women has been an issue, and a situation that disfavours men hasn't really been given any consideration whatsoever, despite the fact that the vast majority of elected representatives in the House of Commons are male. So how does this case stand up? If your case is that, well, we need more female MPs because then, only then, will women's issues be taken seriously, it seems to me that of those issues that are gendered, the issues that are taken seriously now, right now, even with the levels of representation that we have at present, are those issues that disproportionately affect women. So what is it that you're actually after at this point? What is it? It seems to me it's almost as if people that are really bothered about it, they're bothered about it, but not entirely quite sure why it is, what gain it is that they feel that they're going to get from this, but there just simply must be something. Now, one of the reasons that I would suggest for this, and the purpose of this video isn't to go into the reasons why I would suggest, and this is a little tick in the box for feminism here, is that men's issues has never had the equivalent of feminism. Christy Winters, actually, since I mentioned her hangout at the start, she made a video talking about patriarchy and discussing the way in which most lobbyists in the United States are male. And one of the things that wasn't entirely clear from that is surely the most important thing with regard to lobbying isn't whether the lobbyist is male or female so much as the issue itself that's being lobbied for. And it seems to me that most of the things that are lobbied for are fairly gender neutral issues. But in terms of those issues which are strongly gendered issues that affect women rather than men or men rather than women, the overall lobbying potential within society is much greater for those women's issues. And that is largely as a result of feminism and the fact that there is no particular male equivalent of feminism, because after all, everything that we do is lobbying. Effectively, this video is a form of lobbying. Every little newspaper column and every little article that's made puts a little bit of political pressure or gives a little bit of political leeway for MPs to take something on board and say, yeah, I've got public opinion on the side of me with this, and motivates them to go through with it. So maybe that is what makes the difference. So I'm really interested to know what people think about this. What are the tangible differences that it would make with regard to issues that affect women if 50% of MPs were female? And don't we already have a situation where those situations that disfavour women more than men actually seem to be prioritised as things stand at the moment? Okay, well, thank you for listening to what I've had to say, and bye for now.